One thing you might not know about me is I don't just love sci-fi and fantasy. I also love horror. Nothing makes me happier than curling up with a good horror series and scaring the bejesus out of myself. And I think it's time I brought that passion into my miniatures. Hey guys, Jay here. Welcome to Eons of Battle. I am always looking for new models to buy, usually something in a sci-fi to fill out my 40k armies, or something weird and wacky to help my painting. But recently, I discovered this little beauty. Did I say beauty? Well, maybe it's more beauty in the eye of the beholder. This is a Wendigo by Lord of the Prince. This model is frightening, and fear is not something I've gotten out of models before. I love horror and scary stories. Some people love getting thrilled on roller coasters. Some people love working their brains with puzzles. I love scaring the crap out of myself with a good horror story. Now, in terms of the horror stuff I like, I'm not really that much into ghosts or vampires. For me, it's all about the woods. When I was little, I spent a lot of alone time in the woods, and it never really bothered me back then, but now, that's the stuff that really gets under my skin. What was behind that tree? What was watching me unseen? Maybe it was this guy. Often in the videos, you might see a blue headphone dangling out of an ear, and usually it's playing scary stories from some of my favorite creators like Creeps McPasta or Mr. Creeps. I'm gonna let my horror hobby and miniature painting hobby collide in this model. And I can't just paint them up normally. I think if I paint this model too well, it'll not be frightening. If I paint on the muscle definition and all the highlights and shadows, it'll be too obvious. If you can see and understand something, it's not gonna be scary. It's the unknown that is really frightening. That is gonna be my thesis for this paint job. I wanna take full advantage of texture and dry brushing. I wanna retain the disconcerting feeling I have when I look at this model. I have my model, I have my painting plan, it's time for a Getting the Paints montage. In addition to my paints and brushes, I also got some texture paste and Tamiya basic putty. I'm planning on making extensive use of this on the Wendigo. It's time to start texturing my creepy Wendigo, and I'm gonna be starting off with some Tamiya basic putty. Now this stuff is pretty smelly, so I'm gonna be wearing a respirator. I really like Tamiya putty, but it's pretty hazardous to work with. You can use an old paintbrush to stipple it on, but it will 100% kill the brush. I have found that sponge and tweezers work just as well. I tear off a little chunk, put it into my tweezers, and there you have a disposable stippling brush. Then I put a blob of this putty onto my palette. I press some putty into the sponge and then began to stipple it on. It looks very rough on camera, but in reality it's a pretty subtle texture, and I stippled this over 90% of the model, but I didn't lose any details. It just puts on a grit that'll help later with the dry brushing. This putty dries really fast, so as I was working I had to occasionally stop and rip myself off a clean piece of sponge. I even threw this onto his face. He's a scary monster, I don't want him to look too clean. That'll about wrap it up for the basic putty, and he's looking pretty snazzy. This is the subtler of the two effects. Now it's time to go hard with the Vallejo Thick Mud. The Vallejo mud is great stuff, but it also dries pretty quick, so I like to scoop out what I need and put it on a palette so that I don't risk the whole pot going bad on me. Recently, I got about 1 million of these little sauce containers, and I super duper like them. These are a little big, but they're still really good for mixing up washes, and these tops make wonderful disposable palettes. 10 out of 10 would recommend. This is where an old brush comes in handy. I saturate it with the mud paste and then press it onto the model. Only 50% of the model got covered this time. This is the heaviest texture, so I had to pick and choose where it went. It's a little like normal painting. The Tamiya Basic Putty was my base coat, and the Vallejo Mud is my highlights. I made sure to get plenty of this onto his hair. It gives almost a tree bark texture. The Wendigo not only lives in the woods, he is the woods. So I just had kind of a duh moment. I just used the hairdryer to try to speed up the drawing of the putty, and the model got really, really soft. So I probably should have known better, but I'm not going to be using the hairdryer anymore. To me, this texture is a combination of fur, dirt, and evil vibes. The texture paste is applied and he's looking very nice. It's gonna take a little while to dry though, but luckily it's getting pretty late, so I'm gonna leave it to dry overnight, which is like the best case scenario. And then I'm gonna come back tomorrow and I'm gonna paint this sucker up. Not everyone likes spooky stuff, but everyone loves the Eons of Battle Patreon. The best way to support us is by becoming a member of our Patreon. If you enjoy the videos we make, you might consider becoming a member. Over there, you'll gain access to some behind the scenes, voting on what models I paint live here on YouTube, a live hobby hangout every week, and more. With that said, let's get back to the Wendigo. It's been about 8 hours, and this should be perfectly dry. Looks like it is, and he looks really creepy. It's now time for the best part of any project, to throw a little paint on this sucker. I primed the model black. I used my trusty airbrush, but a rattle can would work just as good. Then I set up my wet palette with all the colors I thought I would need. A good old-fashioned black and white, a dark brown, a medium brown, a light brown, yellow, pink, and then just a little bit of green. This should all work together to make a spooky forest spirit. This will be a dry brushing project, and the brushes I use for this are a big old makeup brush. This is my base coater. It lays down a lot of paints. Then I have my dry brush products. These are Army Painter dry brushes, and they have nice short springy hairs that do the job well. And then I have my chisel and spade shaped brushes. These are great if I need to dry brush a specific small area and don't want to accidentally get paint where I don't want it. I kind of wish we could do away with the phrase dry brushing because it's not a very good term. I think a better term would be mostly dry, but just a little bit damp. That leads to much better results when you're dry brushing or damp brushing. Moist brushing? You never really want to put wet paint right onto dry bristles because it'll really mess up your brush really, really fast. And when you dry brush with dry paint, your end result's gonna look really, really dusty because the paint's just dry. But if your paintbrush is just a little bit damp, you'll have a much easier time depositing just a little bit of paint really finely. So, moist brushing. I set up my palette with a paper towel and I prepared my brush, getting it nice and moist, wiping away the excess water on my paper towel, then picking the paint from the palette, working the paint into the bristles. Then I gave it a few wipes on a paper towel and it was ready to work. The dark brown will be my base coat, so I want to cover basically the entire model. I'm wiping the bristles back and forth and the paint is doing a great job of catching on all the raised areas. My makeup brush lets me work really fast because it can deposit a lot of paint, but it can't reach everywhere, so I'm going to switch to one of my little chisel brushes. This is going to let me get in all the little nooks and crannies of the Wendigo. Is it Wendigo or Wendigo? I say Wendigo like indigo, but I think it's okay either way. I've heard it said either way. I think it's okay to put the emphasis on a different syllable. I started applying my medium brown, letting it stick to the top parts of the model, and this was really helping me bring out his muscles. As I was applying this, I noticed that the gritty texture I had was keeping some of the brown and even the black primer still visible. It was making him look very creepy. Then I decided to add in my green. Even though this is the same tone as my medium brown, the difference in color is going to let me use this like a shadow. I put this on the bottom of his body, legs, and arms, and this did a good job of separating those areas without just leaving them super duper dark. Then I went in with my pink, and this highlighted the areas I wanted most prominent and also made him look a little fleshy. I took care to hit his face, his hands, and his shoulders and chest. The pink helped me blend my greens and browns, but he was looking a little too bright now. My highlights are in a really good spot, but I have lost a little bit of the shadows. The dry brushing is picking up the texture paste really well, and even though I haven't touched a traditional paintbrush yet, I feel like I've gotten some really good definition on a lot of his muscles and his flesh. He's really creepy looking. And I probably could have gotten something a lot like this if I had just used traditional brushes, but I really kind of like how spooky and crunchy the texture is on this guy. It is really ending up being a fun little model. I took some water and my chisel dry brush and made myself a wash. The sculpt is excellent and very exaggerated, which is great. It gives me a nice map of where to apply my shadows. I put this in all the creases in the skin and the folds between his muscles. It looks really dark while applying, but it'll lighten up when it dries. I had to go over most areas twice to get it where I wanted, and when I messed up, I could just add in more water to knock down the thickness of the paint. The black wash I threw in this guy, I really dig. It's helped me define all of the different features of his muscles and his body, and I think though he's a smidge dark, so I think a final highlight is in order, and then I can add him on to his nice scenic base. I brought back in my pink, and then I gave a light dry brushing with my smallest dry brush to some key areas like the tops of his arms, shoulders, ribs, and face. On the base which comes with the model, I gave it a base coat of brown. I just used my dirty dry brushes I painted the model with for this. No reason to clean them up. Then I brushed on some light brown and pink to make my highlights. I did this fast so I could blend the stuff while it was all still wet. I used black to create a shadow where the Wendigo will sit. Then a dry brushing of green to make the forest floor look a little bit alive. I painted the rim of the base black, and then it was time to stick down my Wendigo. Then it was time for some decoration. I took some twigs I found outside and glued these down. Then some micro tufts. I really like the smallest sizes. Then I took some clump foliage and tore off small chunks and glued these down with some super glue. So to finish off this Wendigo's base, I am gonna put on some Italian seasoning. And my logic here is that this will look really, really good as generic like ground covering, like the forest floor. I'm hoping I'm gonna varnish this model, and I'm hoping that the varnish seals in the flavor, because I don't really want my models to smell like Italian seasoning, but I think it'll give the exact right effect. So just a pinch of this, and then this model will be done. I watered down some Elmer's glue really, really thin and coated the entire base. And this was a first for me, so I just dumped on my spices. It was pretty thick, but I managed to get rid of a lot of it, and it did a really decent job of looking like leaves and twigs and stuff that coats the forest floor. It looked surprisingly good, but it was a little bit too bright, so I took what was left of my wet palette and made up a dark wash and threw this over everything. And then my super spooky Wendigo was complete. The Wendigo is an evil spirit with a heart of ice. The Wendigo's spirit possesses people and gives them an insatiable cannibalistic hunger. Those who succumb to the Wendigo often take on the appearance of a human-animal hybrid with large horns and deadly claws. They are no longer human. The Wendigo stalks its prey in the deep woods, and those who experience an unnatural chill should beware. Perhaps a Wendigo is nearby. I love this model. I think it turned out great. Not bad for an entire paint job using only dry brushes. I did not once touch a proper paintbrush. I think this style would be a really, really good way to crank out a whole army of minis. I think this stippling and dry brushing would work really, really well on some like Plague Marines for 40k, or maybe some Age of Sigmar giants. It gives a really, really nice sickly, crackly appearance, and I really, really dig it. It's really fun to add this spooky model to my collection. And you know what? Maybe it's time to add a few more. Man, oh man, maybe I should just get a move on and just buy the Morngull from Forge World. It's one of my all-time favorite models, although I know it's a little bit contentious. What do you guys think? I think it's awesome. And who knows, I'm an Age of Sigmar player now, maybe I could actually get it in some games. And for those of you still wondering about the smell of the Italian seasoning, it's not as bad as I thought. It's not as strong as it was, it's still there, but I haven't even thrown a varnish on this, and it has gone away a lot, and
Hey, I've been editing all day and all night. Can we please get a light bulb for the back room?
Nope, there's no budget for it. I feel like it's really interesting how the things that frighten us has changed over the years. Back in the day, it was all about big furry beasts with big muscles, things that were obviously dangerous. But now it's all about mystery, long spindly human-looking things that are incomprehensible. It's really interesting that being uncomfortable is now worse than being in danger. So what do you guys think? Do you like horror just as much as I do? Are there any good horror games out there? I know about Kingdom Death, but that might be it. Maybe horror and war games don't mix. But if you don't want to fall asleep tonight, please look up Local 58 and Gemini Home Entertainment on YouTube. And now it's time for the real star of the show, this week's EOB Complete submissions. We put out a challenge to our community to send us before and after photos of their recently finished models to be immortalized in our videos. If you want to join in the fun, you can submit a before and after photo of your painted mini to our Discord server, which you can find in the description below, or you can post it to Instagram with the hashtag EOBComplete. Without further ado, let's look at and get inspired by what the folks have finished this week. A Stormcast Eternal by Happy Heretic, a Necron Locust Destroyer by Sir Smashy, a Sword-Wielding Adventurer by Kenji Garcia, a Wandering Priest by Ed Scar, an Eldar Warlock by Brooks McK, a Necron Scorpek Destroyer by Disco, a Raging Heroes model by Pharaoh Von Serpio, a Ranger Hero by El Tio, some Primaris Reavers by Asuka, a Chaos War Shrine by Comiconomics, a Star Wars Greedo by Meh Nerd, an Infiltrator Helix by Ryan Yee, some Orc Iron Jaws by Big Guns Never Tire, some Primaris Eradicators by 5-String Connor, some Sith Shadow Guard by Champ Styles, a Kazarkin Plasma Gun Squad by Max Latina, a Death Guard Playcaster by The Rack, a Grim Reaper by Brucifer, some Heavy Intercessors by Z-Rule, some Fenrisian Wolves by Big Pig, an Orc Death Dread by Checkaball, some Imperial Guard Squad Leaders by Just Make Stuff, a Kit-Bashed Orc by Huntron, the Keeper of Secrets by Mondature, and a Necron Overlord by Brett S. Congratulations to everyone for a job well done. It's no small feat to get paint on minis, and you all should feel really proud. Nothing gets the hobby juices flowing like finishing a project, and we all thank you for sharing your work, motivating us and the hobby community to paint our plastic. Thanks for sharing.